20 days before the crime scene tape was unrolled across the manicured lawn. 20 days before the frantic searches began in the cold morning air. A man walked up to a quiet house in a peaceful residential neighborhood. He did not wear a mask to hide his features. He did not carry a weapon in his hands. He simply stood there on January 11th and watched the property. The doorbell camera quietly captured his face, his posture, and his silent observation. He was actively studying the environment. This was not a random act of violence born of sudden rage or a crime of pure opportunity. This was a calculated scouting mission. What exactly did he see on that January 11th evening that made him decide to come back? When he returned nearly 3 weeks later, his face was completely hidden from the digital eye. He wore oversized gloves that made his hands look strangely clumsy and thick. He carried a 25-liter backpack on his shoulders, an item large enough to hold specialized equipment or perhaps something much darker. The timeline break changes everything. Investigators initially thought about this case. Most home invasions are crimes of immediate opportunity, where a suspect sees a cracked window or an unlocked door on a dark street. But this suspect knew the camera was mounted exactly where it was. He knew the specific layout of the porch. He knew exactly who lived inside the residence. The chilling reality of this premeditation transforms a standard missing persons case into a highly complex psychological puzzle. The details in this case are still unfolding, and here at Crime with John, we rely strictly on concrete forensic evidence, not internet rumors. If you appreciate factual deep dives into active investigations, hit subscribe and let us uncover the truth together. The surveillance footage tells a silent story that forensic analysts are only just beginning to decode frame by frame. Every pixel of that digital recording holds a potential clue to his identity, his motives, and his ultimate escape route. Why did he choose this specific house out of all the others on the block? Why wait exactly 20 days to execute his final plan? The answers lie hidden in the digital artifacts of that doorbell camera. The general public sees a masked intruder in the shadows, but behavioral experts see a distinct trail of forensic evidence. The heavy way he walks up the steps, the deliberate way he looks down to avoid the direct line of sight, the awkward hesitation before he finally reaches up for the camera lens. These are the pre-incident indicators that define a methodical predator. We are about to break down the exact sequence of events, relying solely on confirmed law enforcement press releases. There will be no speculation here. The quiet January evening was merely a rehearsal for a nightmare. The main event was waiting in the shadows, slowly ticking down to a terrifying conclusion that would leave investigators baffled and a family desperate for answers. His footprint on the digital timeline is the only thread we have to pull. We must examine every second of his presence to understand the impending tragedy. A human life can sometimes be measured in precise mechanical rhythms and strictly scheduled chemical interventions. At 84 years old, her survival was not a matter of chance, but a matter of routine. Her heart relied on the steady, artificial pulse of a surgically implanted pacemaker. Her body required a daily, unforgiving regimen of essential medications. Missing a single dose was not an inconvenience. It was a direct threat to her biological stability. This profound physical vulnerability is the silent tension that underpins every moment of this investigation. She was not someone who could simply walk away and start a new life. She was anchored to her home by the absolute necessity of medical maintenance. On the evening of January 31st, the house was filled with the familiar comforts of family. She shared a warm dinner with her son-in-law, Tommaso. The conversation, the shared meal, the ordinary nature of the evening provided a false sense of absolute security. The world inside the house was safe, predictable, and heavily insulated from the darkness outside. According to confirmed reports from the Associated Press and CNN, Tommaso safely escorted her back to her residence. The timeline places his departure at exactly 9:50 in the evening. He made sure she was settled. He checked the surroundings, saw nothing out of the ordinary, and drove away. The taillights of his vehicle faded down the quiet street, taking with them the last layer of protection she had. Inside the house, the 84-year-old woman was left entirely alone with the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the clock. She likely went through her nightly routine, preparing her medications for the next morning, completely unaware of the digital memory stored in her doorbell camera from 20 days prior. She did not know that a man without a mask had already stood on her porch. She did not know that the architectural layout of her front entrance had already been mapped and analyzed. The profound asymmetry between the victim and the perpetrator creates a chilling atmospheric dread. On one side of the locked door was an elderly woman whose very heartbeat was managed by a machine. On the other side of the door was a void, waiting to be filled by someone who had spent 3 weeks planning an intrusion. The house stood completely dark. The street was empty. The cold night air settled over the property, wrapping the home in a suffocating silence. The security of the locked front door was merely an illusion, a fragile barrier against a threat that had already done its reconnaissance. She went to sleep trusting the safety of her neighborhood, completely isolated from the violent reality that was about to shatter her carefully maintained existence. The ticking clock moved past midnight, pushing the timeline into February 1st. The medications sat unused on the counter. The pacemaker continued its steady rhythm in the dark. Outside, the shadows began to shift, and the unease of the empty street slowly morphed into a tangible, approaching nightmare. The sheer physical fragility of the victim makes the calculated nature of the impending crime feel even more deeply unsettling. Investigators would later look back at this exact moment, 9:50 in the evening, as the final second of normalcy. Once the son-in-law drove away, the invisible countdown reached its final stage. There was no one left to intervene. There was no one left to hear a cry for help. The house was a quiet island in the middle of a sleeping suburb, perfectly primed for an unseen predator to step out of the darkness and cross the threshold. The deep silence of the early morning hours on February 1st was abruptly broken by the motion sensor of the front porch surveillance system. The digital eye woke up, silently recording the immediate area as a figure stepped into the frame. It was the early hours of the morning, a time when the entire neighborhood was deep in sleep. The camera captured a male suspect moving deliberately toward the front door. This was not the barefaced scout from January 11th. This figure was heavily concealed, stripped of any identifiable human features. He wore a dark mask that completely covered his face, leaving only dark voids where his eyes should be. His hands were engulfed in strangely oversized gloves, a detail that immediately struck behavioral analysts as highly unusual. On his back, he carried a large 25-liter backpack, suggesting he was prepared to carry away items or bring in significant equipment. But the most alarming detail was what he held in his hands. The footage clearly showed the suspected intruder gripping an unidentified object, heavily suspected to be a weapon, indicating that he was fully prepared to use physical force to achieve his objective. The alleged intruder did not immediately attempt to force the door open. Instead, he directed his attention straight up at the lens of the doorbell camera. He knew it was there. He reached up with those thick, oversized gloves, his movements appearing clumsy and uncoordinated. He grappled with the device, desperately trying to disable the visual feed. The footage shows a brief, terrifying struggle between the masked man and the digital sentry. The camera shakes. The angle tilts violently. The image distorts as the heavy gloves smear the plastic casing. This was a direct, physical assault on the only witness to the crime. For several agonizing seconds, the suspect wrestles with the camera, his heavy breathing almost palpable through the silent recording. The clumsy nature of the gloves makes his task difficult, causing a delay that provides law enforcement with critical frames of visual evidence. We see the tension in his shoulders. We see the sheer determination to plunge the porch into darkness. The deliberate targeting of the security system proves that this was a highly organized operation meant to leave no trace. He was attempting to blind the house before he breached it. The struggle with the camera highlights a terrifying reality about modern security. Technology can record a crime, but it cannot stop a determined assailant. The physical barrier of the door was the only thing, standing between the heavy-set intruder and the sleeping 84-year-old woman inside. The camera lens finally succumbs to the tampering. The visual feed flickers violently, the digital artifacts breaking apart into a chaotic mosaic of pixels before the screen goes entirely black. The video cuts out. The silence returns. But the darkness that follows is far more terrifying than the grainy footage itself. The entire incident, the breach of the home, the confrontation, the extraction, all of it vanishes into the unrecorded void. We are left staring at a blank screen, knowing that behind that disabled camera, a violent and irreversible event is taking place. The sudden absence of information forces the mind to construct the horrors of what happened next. How did he get past the locks? Did she wake up? Was there a struggle in the dark hallway? The disabled camera represents a total loss of control, a terrifying plunge into the unknown. The suspect successfully severed the digital connection to the outside world, isolating his target completely. He had the weapon, he had the backpack, he had the element of absolute surprise. And now, he had the cover of total, impenetrable darkness. The final frozen frame of the video, showing a gloved hand aggressively covering the lens, is a haunting monument to the vulnerability of the victim. The technology that was supposed to protect her became the very thing that documented her ultimate: isolation. When the morning sun finally rose and law enforcement arrived at the quiet suburban home, the illusion of a peaceful neighborhood was completely shattered. The 84-year-old resident was nowhere to be found. The initial hope, the desperate wish that perhaps an elderly woman with medical issues had simply wandered off in a state of confusion, was instantly obliterated by what investigators discovered waiting for them at the front entrance. The physical state of the porch told a story of sudden, brutal violence. Crime scene technicians immediately locked down the perimeter. They found clear signs of a physical struggle right outside the front door. But the most damning piece of evidence was not a scuff mark or a broken lock. It was biological. There was a significant presence of a biological substance on the porch. The forensic team moved in with swabs and collection kits, treating the front steps as ground zero of a major violent crime. The samples were rushed to the laboratory for emergency analysis. The results came back and completely altered the trajectory of the investigation. The DNA profile, extracted from the biological evidence on the porch, was a confirmed 100% match to the missing homeowner. She had been bleeding. The reality of the DNA match hit the investigative team like a physical blow. This was no longer a simple search and rescue operation. This was a confirmed violent abduction, or worse. A fragile elderly woman, entirely dependent on a pacemaker and daily medication, had suffered a physical trauma severe enough to leave her DNA scattered across her own front porch. She was taken into the cold morning air without her life-saving prescriptions. The clock was no longer just ticking. It was accelerating toward a catastrophic medical failure. The presence of the DNA on the porch transforms the blank screen of the doorbell camera into a canvas of absolute dread. We now know that the struggle did not just happen inside the house. It spilled out onto the front steps. The masked man with the oversized gloves and the 25-liter backpack had physically overpowered her. He had hurt her. The biological evidence is the undeniable proof of a violent confrontation that the camera was blinded from seeing. The stakes of the investigation skyrocketed instantly. Every hour that passed without her medication increased the probability of a fatal cardiac event. The local police department realized they were dealing with a highly dangerous, methodical predator who was currently holding a medically fragile hostage. The crime scene tape expanded. The forensic sweep intensified. They scoured the neighborhood for any secondary trace evidence, any drop of blood that might indicate the direction of travel. But the perpetrator had vanished, taking his victim and melting into the suburban landscape. The DNA on the porch remains, the ultimate anchor of truth in a case that was about to spiral into digital madness. It is the cold, clinical proof of a violent physical reality. She did not leave willingly. She was attacked at her own threshold. The discovery of the biological evidence marks the absolute point of no return for the family and the authorities. To follow this complex forensic journey and ensure you never miss a critical update on active investigations, subscribe to Crime with John right now. We are about to dive deep into the behavioral analysis of the suspect, dissecting every movement he made to understand exactly who we are dealing with. The blood on the porch is just the first layer of a rapidly thickening mystery. The investigators had the DNA, they had the masked footage, but they still had absolutely no idea who was behind the oversized gloves. The hunt was officially on, and the enemy was a ghost who had carefully planned his every move. The forensic reality of the biological evidence is impossible to ignore. It grounds the investigation in undeniable physical trauma. The suspect could hide his face, he could disable the camera, but he could not erase the violent biological signature he left behind on the concrete. The Federal Bureau of Investigation officially stepped in, bringing their elite behavioral analysis units and advanced digital forensics teams to bear on the baffling crime scene. The investigation immediately bifurcated into two distinct paths: the physical hunt for the victim and the psychological deconstruction of the suspect. The FBI analysts focused their absolute attention on the only piece of verified visual evidence they possessed: the doorbell camera footage from the early hours of February 1st. They subjected the brief video to intense, frame-by-frame scrutiny, looking for microscopic behavioral leaks that the suspect might not even realize he was making. A former FBI special agent publicly weighed in on the footage, highlighting a fascinating contradiction in the behavior of the alleged perpetrator. The crime was undeniably premeditated. The reconnaissance on January 11th, the specialized backpack, the deliberate targeting of the camera, all pointed to a highly organized thought process. However, the execution was remarkably amateurish. The use of oversized gloves, for instance, was a glaring tactical error. While they concealed fingerprints and skin tone, they severely limited his manual dexterity. This lack of fine motor control is exactly what caused him to struggle so awkwardly when attempting to disable the surveillance device. A highly trained operative would have chosen form-fitting tactical gloves to maintain control over his weapon and his environment. The oversized gloves suggest someone trying too hard to hide, overcompensating out of fear or inexperience. Furthermore, analysts noted his distinct eye movements. Even behind the mask, his physical posture indicated that he was actively looking down, deliberately avoiding a direct line of sight with the lens until the very last moment. This indicates a deep, conscious awareness of surveillance, yet his fumbling approach to neutralizing it exposes a lack of practical experience in high-stress, tactical situations. He was a planner, not a professional operator. As the behavioral profile slowly took shape, investigators simultaneously worked to clear the immediate inner circle. In almost all domestic abduction cases, law enforcement looks closest to home first. The son-in-law, Tommaso, was subjected to rigorous questioning and timeline verification. Authorities scrutinized his movements, his communications, and his alibi. According to confirmed reports from CNN, the police officially cleared Tommaso and the immediate family from the suspect list. His departure at 9:50 in the evening was corroborated, and his innocence was established. The focus violently shifted back to the masked stranger. The realization that this was a targeted attack by an unknown outsider sent shockwaves through the investigative team. The pre-incident scoping 20 days prior meant the victim was specifically chosen, monitored, and hunted. The investigation began to hit a terrifying wall of silence. The physical trail ended at the biological evidence on the porch. The digital trail ended when the camera was blinded. The suspect had effectively vanished into the ether, leaving behind no license plates, no digital footprint, and no clear motive. Why target an 84-year-old woman with a pacemaker? There was no obvious financial gain, no known enemies, and no apparent reason for such a complex, calculated operation against a vulnerable elderly target. The lack of motive paralyzed the analytical process. Investigators were staring at a behavioral profile of a clumsy but determined predator, but they had absolutely no context for his actions. The silence from the perpetrator was deafening. Days began to pass, and the medical reality of the victim, missing her pacemaker medication, hung over the command center like a dark cloud. Every lead seemed to evaporate upon closer inspection. The neighborhood canvassing yielded no additional footage. The forensic analysis of the camera housing provided no usable latent prints due to the heavy gloves. The investigation was desperate for a break, a mistake by the suspect, or a communication that would explain the reason behind the nightmare. Just as the detectives were bracing for the grim possibility of a prolonged, cold case scenario, the silence was finally broken. But the communication did not come through a secure police hotline or a verified intermediary. It arrived in a chaotic, decentralized explosion of digital noise. A sudden influx of information began to flood the email inboxes of major media outlets, completely bypassing law enforcement. Investigators had spent days meticulously analyzing the posture of a single man on a porch. Now, they were suddenly faced with an overwhelming volume of text and demands. The authorities were suddenly playing catch-up in a game where the rules were changing by the timbre hose. Second, the physical crime scene offered nothing but microscopic traces and shattered plastics, but the digital realm suddenly erupted into absolute chaos. Newsrooms across the country began receiving strange, encrypted communications. These were not the typical handwritten letters of past decades. They were sophisticated electronic messages, demanding astronomical sums of money to be transferred exclusively through decentralized cryptocurrency networks. The senders specifically demanded Bitcoin, a method designed to obscure the financial trail and paralyze tracking teams. These alleged communications contained chilling descriptions claiming the elderly captive was still breathing, still waiting in some undisclosed location. The sheer volume of these demands created a terrifying labyrinth of information for federal agents to navigate. In the center of this storm stood a prominent public figure. Nancy Guthrie, a widely recognized television host, was forced to transform her public platform into a desperate broadcasting beacon for her captive mother. She stood before national cameras, her usual journalistic composure replaced by raw, unvarnished terror. Through major broadcast networks, she announced a staggering $1 million reward for any verified information leading to a safe return. But she did not just ask for tips. She demanded a specific, undeniable verification. She pleaded directly into the lens, begging the shadow operatives for a proof of life. She needed visual or audio confirmation that her mother had survived the initial trauma. This phrase, broadcasted to millions of viewers, became the catalyst for a massive secondary crisis. The internet, a constantly churning engine of speculation, took that desperate plea and weaponized it. Online forums and amateur sleuth communities latched onto the phrase with reckless abandon. Within hours, a localized tragedy mutated into a viral phenomenon. Anonymous users began posting elaborate theories, claiming that a secret, unreleased video of the captive was already circulating on the dark web. They insisted that law enforcement was intentionally suppressing a recording showing the victim holding a current newspaper or speaking directly to the camera. The rumor spread with the velocity of a contagion, infecting social media feeds and dominating podcast discussions. The phenomenon of crowdsourced investigations often yields valuable leads, but in this specific instance, the collective obsession created a dangerous fog. The sheer magnitude of the reward money acted as an absolute magnet for the worst elements of the digital underworld. Scammers from various continents, completely unconnected to the original intrusion, saw an opportunity to exploit a highly publicized vulnerability. They crafted messages using language scraped from news reports, attempting to mimic the cadence of a sophisticated syndicate. Federal agents had to deploy specialized cyber units to dissect the metadata of these messages, diverting critical attention away from the physical geography of the suspect's escape route. The agonizing reality for the family was that every notification, every breaking news alert, carried the potential for salvation or unimaginable heartbreak. The public visibility meant that the family's suffering was consumed as a spectacle by millions, while the genuine leads remained buried under mountains of fabricated data. The investigators were caught in a brutal crossfire between a silent, physical predator and a deafening, digital mob. The structural integrity of the case was under massive threat from this unprecedented level of external interference. If you find value in cutting through the noise to examine real forensic developments, make sure you subscribe to Crime with John right now, because the truth of this case is far darker than any online fabrication. The authorities were preparing to make a calculated strike to reclaim control of the narrative, a move that would shatter the illusions of the internet and force everyone to face a devastating reality. The turning point arrived not with a dramatic rescue, but with a cold, devastating press conference. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, backed by local law enforcement, stepped up to the podium to deliver a surgical strike against the rampant misinformation. The lead investigator looked directly into the cameras and dismantled the digital mirage piece by piece. The statement was absolute. The highly discussed proof of life video did not exist. It had never existed. According to verified reports from PBS and the Associated Press, authorities categorically denied that any visual or audio confirmation of the victim's survival had ever been received by the family or the police. The entire internet obsession, the countless hours of forum debates, and the viral social media threads were entirely based on a phantom artifact. The public had essentially hallucinated a piece of evidence out of sheer collective anxiety and the desperate wishes of a grieving daughter. The revelation was a psychological earthquake. The sudden deletion of this supposed video from the factual record completely changed the atmosphere of the case. But the authorities did not stop at debunking the rumor. They addressed the overwhelming flood of cryptocurrency demands. The cyber division revealed that these messages lacked the required authenticity markers of a genuine ransom situation. They did not follow the established clinical protocols used by organized abduction rings. The communications were sloppy, opportunistic, and entirely disconnected from the physical reality of the crime scene. Then came the enforcement action. authorities confirmed the arrest of at least one male suspect who had allegedly attempted to extort the family. This individual, operating from behind a screen, had tried to leverage the high-profile nature of the tragedy to secure a massive financial windfall. He had no connection to the missing woman. He possessed no inside knowledge of the porch, the timeline, or the camera. He was simply a predator of a different species, feeding on the emotional wreckage left behind by the actual perpetrator. The arrest of the scammer was a hollow victory. It cleared the board of the static noise, but it left behind a terrifying silence. The collapse of the ransom narrative meant that the real captor had never reached out. The real captor did not want cryptocurrency. The real captor did not want to negotiate. The horrifying realization settled over the command center. The objective of the intrusion was never financial extortion. The entire premise of a hostage negotiation was a fiction. When you strip away the fake emails, the arrested scammer, and the non-existent video, you are left staring into an abyss. The perpetrator had successfully executed a targeted extraction and then completely vanished without making a single demand. This level of absolute silence from a suspect is statistically rare in financially motivated crimes, pointing toward a much darker, purely malicious intent. The noise had successfully distracted everyone from the core truth. The only genuine interaction the suspect ever had with the outside world was the violent struggle with the surveillance device. To help us combat the spread of false information in crucial investigations like this, please like and share this video so the algorithm can push verified facts to the forefront. The complete absence of genuine communication forced behavioral analysts to radically revise their threat assessment. The offender was not seeking leverage. The offender was seeking total possession or immediate destruction of the target. The millions of dollars offered sat entirely untouched, a monument to the terrifying reality that money cannot buy answers from a ghost. The investigation had been chased through a digital labyrinth, only to find a dead end, forcing detectives to turn around and face the cold, hard facts, waiting back at the beginning. The systemic clearing of the digital noise forced a massive recalibration within the law enforcement hierarchy. The initial operational framework, built around the hope of a safe recovery and a negotiated release, was officially dismantled. The command structure publicly announced a definitive shift in the classification of the incident. This was no longer categorized as a search for a missing, endangered adult. The parameters were officially upgraded to a full-scale criminal homicide and kidnapping investigation. According to confirmed reporting from the Associated Press and PBS, this administrative change carried massive legal and logistical weight. It meant the deployment of different resources, the activation of specialized forensic recovery teams, and the grim acknowledgement that the probability of finding the victim alive had dropped to near zero. The classification shift was a heavy blow to the community. The untouched $1 million reward fund became a haunting symbol of absolute helplessness. Wealth, influence, and national media coverage had proven completely ineffective against the calculating silence of the perpetrator. The investigative focus aggressively snapped back to the physical reality of the neighborhood. They returned to the exact geometry of the escape routes, analyzing traffic patterns and localized cellular tower dumps from that specific early morning window. The detectives were back to hunting a physical entity, relying on the microscopic traces left behind in the real world, rather than chasing phantoms through internet routing protocols. But a profound, agonizing question remained entirely unanswered. What was the ultimate destination of that large capacity bag? If the goal was not financial gain, and the target was a highly vulnerable elderly individual, what could possibly drive the complex logistics of this operation? The lack of a clear motive remained the most significant obstacle to identifying the suspect. Investigators could map the how and the when, but the why was completely obscured in darkness. The transition from a rescue mission to a recovery and prosecution operation marked the darkest chapter of the ordeal. The medical reality of the situation could no longer be ignored or minimized. The strict regimen of cardiac medication and the delicate functioning of the implanted device meant that the biological threshold for survival had almost certainly been crossed days, if not weeks, ago. The authorities were now searching for a crime scene rather than a captive. The realization that the perpetrator had likely watched the house for an extended period, understanding the absolute vulnerability of the resident, elevated the crime to a level of profound depravity. The neighborhood, once considered a sanctuary, was permanently scarred by the knowledge that such a methodical predator had walked among them, undetected, carefully planning the destruction of a family. The detectives continued to grind through the agonizingly slow process of eliminating every possible variable. The family was left suspended in an indefinite state of traumatic uncertainty, holding on to the fading hope of forensic closure, waiting for a resolution that seemed completely out of reach. What this case teaches us about the mechanics of criminal behavior is deeply unsettling. The initial, unmasked reconnaissance visit captured weeks prior introduces a critical concept known in security circles as pre-incident indicators. Violent, organized crimes rarely occur in a vacuum. Predators engage in a phase of scoping or target acquisition. They test vulnerabilities, establish routines, and map out the environment long before they commit to an action. The absolute necessity of recognizing and reporting unfamiliar individuals loitering or observing residential spaces cannot be overstated. That unmasked visit was the single greatest vulnerability the suspect exposed, and identifying such anomalies is the most effective layer of civilian defense. Beyond the physical threat, this case serves as a massive indictment of the modern true crime ecosystem. The proliferation of the fake video rumor and the subsequent extortion attempts demonstrate how digital noise actively sabotages real-world justice. When public obsession outpaces verified facts, the resulting misinformation forces law enforcement to waste irreplaceable hours chasing internet ghosts instead of analyzing physical crime scenes. It highlights a dangerous societal shift, where the consumption of tragedy as entertainment directly interferes with the legal system's ability to operate efficiently. The insatiable demand for immediate answers creates a breeding ground for manipulation, proving that in the digital age, unchecked speculation is just as dangerous as a contaminated physical crime scene. We must learn to critically evaluate the sources of breaking news in active investigations. The responsibility falls on the public to reject unverified claims and demand rigorous forensic confirmation. When a community amplifies rumors, they inadvertently become accomplices in the obfuscation of the truth, granting the actual perpetrator the ultimate cover of chaos. The final image etched into the public consciousness is not the media frenzy or the fraudulent demands. It is the jarring, violent static of a broken surveillance feed. It is the image of a heavily disguised man, stepping deliberately out of the camera's view and melting into the suburban darkness. He successfully disrupted the timeline, manipulated the physical environment, and vanished without a trace. The authorities are still hunting, still waiting for the forensic breakthrough that will finally unmask him. He is still out there, carrying the weight of his actions. But the evidence leaves us with a chilling question to ponder. Based on the deliberate but clumsy handling of the security equipment, the oversized gloves, and the specific choice of that large capacity gear, what do you think the suspect's actual profession or background might realistically be? Let me know your detailed theories down in the comments below. And if you want to continue deciphering complex investigations using only verified facts and strict forensic analysis, make sure you hit the subscribe button for Crime with John. We never rely on rumors. We only follow the evidence. I will see you all in the next case file.